It's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening to our 5th annual Baltimore Sun Foreign Policy Panel, which will be held in this room for the last time. We'll certainly go over to another location, and we apologize to everyone for the inconvenience of there being a large crowd, but actually we're delighted in a sense that you respond so positively to what we think is one of our best programs. You've met most of the panelists before, those of you who have been steady attenders of past council meetings. Mr. Joe Stern will chair this evening's panel. You know him as the editor of the editorial pages of the Sun. Of course, he headed the Bonn and London bureaus before joining the Sun. Mr. Cordry is known to you both from his appearances on Washington's Week in Review and as the defense correspondent of the Sun. Mr. Henry Truitt is not with us this evening. He's in Geneva, but that disappointment is balanced by the opportunity for Mr. Fred Barnes to join us this evening, who hasn't been on the panel before. He's brought along his own army with him, I see. I promised Mr. Stern that this would be a brief introduction. So with no further ado, it's a great pleasure to turn the panel over to Mr. Stern.
Let me say that this is a great pleasure for us too. This is not only our 5th annual Baltimore Sun panel on foreign affairs, but it also marks the end of a cycle. When we first met 4 years ago, Jimmy Carter was a lame duck, and we were very much wondering what was going to happen to this country and the world as a former movie actor took over as President of the United States. I think what we should celebrate tonight, even though Henry Truitt isn't here to give us a bluegrass encore at the end of our program, what we should celebrate tonight, I think, is a bit of continuity. When Carter was elected president, he thought he had to reinvent the wheel, and he came up with a brand new arms control package which immediately stymied the momentum on SALT II negotiations that had started under President Ford. When President Reagan took office, he again stopped all momentum on arms control negotiations, and Walt Rostel even declared publicly that the new administration would need about a year and a half to get its thinking in order. I think what we're celebrating tonight is Geneva. What we're celebrating tonight is an administration that has had 4 years to learn some hard lessons and to formulate a negotiation posture that will carry on. We will not be forcing the world to adjust once again to another one-term president. We have a new dimension in today's panel in that Fred Barnes is here. He is our chief political correspondent. He covered the 1984 elections every step of the way. What we're going to do, because Fred is here, he is going to give us a rundown on the political election of 1984, particularly as it was affected by foreign policy, and also discuss some of the foreign policy issues that will be facing the administration and how political pressures will impinge on these decisions. Charles Cordry, as usual, will give us his rundown of the strategic and security and defense posture, and at the end I'll try to pick up a few little pieces. But what we really try to do is limit our remarks so that you can have at us. And without further ado, I'd like to give Fred Barnes his allotted 8 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. One thing the election ensured was that we will have a resolute, determined, aggressive hardliner in the White House. But you probably don't want to hear about Nancy. The campaign really did not have a big foreign policy aspect, as you all probably know from having seen it and read about it. It was more about phrases and chants such as USA, USA, and ideas like standing tall and going for the gold, being number one. I think all those do mean something in the policy context, but vaguely. There was one clear change that President Reagan made in his public posture during the campaign on foreign policy, and that was his approach toward the Soviet Union and what he said about them. There were a lot of reasons for that. One was because his wife was very worried that he would become, in her words, the war candidate. She didn't think that a war candidate or someone perceived as a war candidate would have a very good chance of being reelected. That's one of the reasons why she turned against Bill Clark when he was the National Security Advisor. She thought he was too much of a hardliner and was creating a war candidate. As it turned out, we did not get a war candidate at all. Reagan started talking differently about the Soviets. He conducted what was sort of a peace offensive. Gromyko showed up in September or October, and after that, the Soviets have warmed up and a lot of things have happened. At one point, Reagan even agreed to talks in Vienna with the Soviets if they were on his terms. The Soviets didn't agree. But there was a change in the rhetoric coming from Reagan and from the White House, which probably won't change again now that arms control talks are going to begin in March or later in the spring. One issue that did come up in the campaign was Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and I think the announcement yesterday excuse me, in Geneva has vindicated Reagan's stand on that. Mondale came out strongly against Star Wars and denounced a space race in the heavens, but Star Wars seems to have had a dramatic impact in getting the Soviets to drop their preconditions and agree to go back to arms control talks. They certainly gave up much more than the Reagan administration did, and Reagan's position, I think anyway, of saying that his policy would eventually bring the Soviets around, that they would come back, that just standing firmly would convince them to do that, was vindicated. Anyway, Mondale appears to have been wrong, at least in the short term, about a good effect Star Wars might have. Reagan was vindicated. Grenada also came up, and it came up in two ways. First, it helped Reagan's popularity very much. Secondly, it was denounced strongly by most of the Democratic presidential contenders during the primary season, but then in the general election, Mondale came out strongly in favor of, not strongly in favor of, but said he would have done the same thing in Grenada. So that was a strong endorsement of that policy, I thought, of President Reagan. So much for the campaign. What about the political pressures on Reagan in his second term in the foreign policy area? I don't think there are great ones. I think Reagan has tremendous flexibility to do what he wants to do in foreign policy, and he's a guy who feels very strongly about a few areas of foreign policy. I think one of the truest, most heartfelt phrases that Reagan ever uttered was when he called the Soviet Union the focus of evil. He truly believes that. His whole career, everything he said for 20 years in his political career suggests that he believes it. Nonetheless, he agreed to arms control talks, even sought them, because there was political pressure for that. There is still political pressure for that. We do have the talks. I don't think there is great pressure on Reagan to get an arms control agreement very quickly, now that the talks have begun. I think people expect them to drag on for some time, and no doubt they will. Reagan also gets a little more flexibility because the country still seems to be on this patriotic, nationalistic binge that you see showing up on TV and commercials now, with Budweiser showing the Statue of Liberty and songs about America and so on. I think that, in a vague kind of way, helps Reagan. Also, some of the movies that you see, I think, help create a climate or reflect a climate that is helpful to Reagan. One I just saw, I got a VCR at Christmas, and a friend of mine had recommended a movie called Uncommon Valor. I don't know whether you've seen it or not. It's with Gene Hackman. It's about a military man who's retired who goes in to Laos to get his son out, who had been a POW who was kept there. Actually, wasn't too bad. There was another movie also that came out about the same subject, Missing in Action. I think those reflect this patriotic feeling that's in the country that Reagan helps to encourage as well. And in some areas, Reagan gets some flexibility in foreign policy because nobody seems to have a better idea of what to do. Obviously, Reagan has not found a solution in the Middle East. Far from it. His policy was tried, and it didn't get anywhere. For an overall solution, he didn't exactly do well in Lebanon, but nobody else seems to have a competing or better idea of how to solve the problem in the Middle East. In Central America, Reagan has been helped greatly by something that he didn't produce, and that was the election of Napoleon Duarte as the president of El Salvador. El Salvador doesn't seem to even be much of an issue now. Nicaragua is, and certainly there is political pressure not to put American troops down there, combat troops. Short of that, Reagan probably has a good bit of flexibility, though I don't expect Congress to pass a bill that would allow aid to the Contras again. They're going to get money anyway, just not from Congress. They can get it from private sources or money funneled through other countries or so on. The debate in the administration is going to be over whether an agreement should be pursued aggressively with the Sandinistas, some sort of an agreement over whether they would all outside military force should be removed, and with the Sandinistas agreeing not to try to expand their revolution beyond its borders. There are different, some people in the administration think it should be pursued, some not. In any event, there's not great political pressure either way on that one. There's one thing to remember, though, about Reagan and foreign policy, and that is his popularity depends a great deal on the idea that he is a guy of conviction, unusual in a politician in that regard, who is willing to act on his convictions even if he has to take an unpopular stand. And you see this show up in polls where people are asked, particularly against Mondale in the fall, do you think this candidate is forceful and decisive? And Reagan, you know, it was off the charts, people saying yes, and Mondale didn't do too well. He did well on the wimp factor, but not on the forceful and decisive factor. Joe says I'm going to have to wind up. I'll let Charlie talk about the MX and the trade deficit. We don't care about that right now too much. Let me mention one thing where I think Reagan may do something if Castro gives him just a little bit of help, and that is normalize relations with Cuba. I think Reagan would like to make some gesture like that. The agreement on the Mariel boat-lift people that are left suggested that there might be further things, but Castro has to make some gesture. He refused to do that with Carter, but if he removed some or all of the 31,000 troops in Angola, I think something really might happen with the Reagan administration in Cuba.
Charlie?
Joe, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I agree with my colleague down the line here that there is a rash of patriotism, but I would like to tell you that I've spent the last day and a half in New York with a military media task force that's been assembled by the 20th Century Fund, and I have to assure you that the military's definition of patriotism is entirely different from the one that the military assigns to the press. But because we argue that it's patriotic to find out what the truth is and expose it, whatever it might be. I don't know whether I told you this one last year or not, but I think of it as I think back to the what happened in Geneva, and that is that there was a sign in England having to do with the importance of child care, which read that the first few moments of life are the most difficult. And somebody had inked in underneath, the last few are a bit tricky, too. I suggest we're now at the tricky stage. Joe told me to talk about national security. That's something that any president can't define, but he'd never better go against it. It's a very difficult thing to define. I want to talk about just two aspects of it. One has to do with the defense costs, and the other has to do with arms control, and they're both very closely related. After the election, which Fred's been talking to you about, Mr. Stockman broke the news to the president that the deficit was going sky high. The result was a new thing as far as defense is concerned, a wholly new thing. You could search high and low, and aside from Jack Kemp, you could not find a Republican in Congress who disagreed with the thought that the defense budget has got to be cut, whatever that means. It's easy to talk about cutting it. It's a little harder to do it, but this time they mean business, apparently. This year there is no Senator Tower to carry the hod for the president. Barry Goldwater, of all people, has said that he would be willing to throw away the MX. And that's about all I'm going to say on the MX, Fred. The administration, confronted with this deficit, had, as far as defense is concerned, two choices. It could decide what it wanted to do about cutting defense, or it could throw the ball into Congress and let the Congress decide what it wanted to do about cutting defense. The fact of the matter is the administration did a little of each. And I reckon that means that downtown in Washington, they calculated about where they'd come out in Congress if they asked for about how much. We will see whether they calculated correctly or not with the passage of time. What did happen was that Mr. Reagan went along with his defense secretary, and he cut the defense spending projections, and that's all they are, a little less than half of what Mr. Stockman wanted to do. The cuts were cosmetic. They left no program in any danger that I can think of, certainly none that has been in the public eye. The defense buildup is intact at this moment, in spite of the cosmetic cuts in projected future spending. So the question is, what can Congress do? And I keep reading in the papers that all the Republican leadership is going to slash away at defense. I even have read that they are thinking of a freeze on all federal spending. I don't quite know what that means, but I assume it doesn't mean freezing it where it is, because that's impossible, if anything is. They may mean freezing it in the sense that they would cover inflation. That would be very hard to do as well, and I'll be glad to tell you why, but I will let you ask me, because I want to go on before my 8 minutes are over, to arms control, to Geneva. The Secretary of State said that this was an important beginning, but I think that that is about where we ought to let it lie, or that's where we ought to consider that it is at this point, an important beginning. What the results in Geneva showed, in fact, what the decisions to go to Geneva showed, was that the two superpowers had made a declaration of political will. They realized that confrontation was no longer the best thing to do. So I think that obviously the arms control is at the center of the confrontation, and so it has to be on the front burner. But the essential first point is that politically the two governments have decided that they have to have something that Henry Kissinger has recently called détente. And on the whole, he's probably right. Now, why has this happened? I think that from President Reagan's point of view, he had his defense buildup in place, and while whatever Congress does to it, it's going to continue upward for at least a while. We have had a 5-year defense buildup. I could argue the point that we've had a 6-year one, but I'm certain that it's been going on for 5 years. He had his place in history to think about, and balancing the budget is not the one that's going to be his place in history, I think. But arms control could be. Americans, I believe, and our allies, I believe, are tired of the confrontation between the superpowers, and they're worried sick about it, and I think the president sensed that. So I think that, yes, as Fred said, he may very well have been vindicated in waiting this long and in looking to our defenses first. This may or may not have been the reason that Chernenko thought that we should negotiate. Certainly, the Politburo knew that they had Ronald Reagan for 4 more years. There was nothing they could do about that. They have economic problems in the Soviet Union, which it's a lot easier to solve by importing technology, by trade, than it is by loosening up the political grip on the domestic economy. And so I think they would like, once again using that word détente, to do something that would get them back into the business of importing things that are important to them. I think that the American buildup obviously has frightened the Soviet Union. Certainly the technological lead that this country undoubtedly has worried the Soviet Union, and the emphasis on the Star Wars technology it seems that the apprehension in Moscow about that is quite genuine. So I think all these factors have combined, and there may be many others, to cause the two countries to agree to negotiate on arms control. I would just like to discuss only one aspect of the arms control thing, and that very briefly, and that is the relationship between defense and offense. In 1967, was it at Glassboro, 67? That sounds right to me. The President of the United States took his defense secretary to explain to the Russians how it was impossible to defend yourself against ballistic missiles. And he apparently sold Kosygin on this point of view. And we got in 1972 a treaty banning ballistic missile defenses. The exercise this time was the President of the United States sending his Secretary of State and a large team to begin telling the Soviet Union how good defense is. A rather interesting turnaround, and they may have been right on both occasions, but this is one of the important points that is going to persist all through whatever arms negotiations there are, and that is, to what extent can you dare to reduce your offensive nuclear forces and rely on some sort of defense which has not yet been invented but is very rapidly in the process of being designed. So I think that's the big issue, the relationship between defense and offense. And with that, I will wind down. My 8 minutes are up, I'm sure.
Yes, they are. In my role as temporary Henry Truett of the evening, I'm going to hop-skip a little bit around the world and then open this up to questions, which is always the liveliest part of the evening. I think we can't let this yearly review go by without noticing what has happened in Western Europe since we last met. When we last met, we had just begun deployment of our missiles. This was after a very long campaign by the European neutralist left against the deployment. It took an enormous expenditure of capital by Chancellor Kohl in Bonn to bring this to pass. And since that time, we have seen some receding of the democratic left movement in Europe. I think Ronald Reagan is lucky, he always seems to be lucky, in that there seems to be a worldwide trend in his direction. You look at Europe, he has Thatcher, he has Kohl, and he even has Mitterrand on important issues of foreign policy. In the Pacific, he has a Chinese government that is finding all sorts of merit in the free enterprise system. He has a Chinese government that is welcoming his turnaround, his learning experience in dealing with the China question. In Tokyo, he has a prime minister who at least asserts a Japanese role as the unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific. So that you have, I think, something of a world reflection of what's happened here. As we all know, Reagan has changed the political dialogue, the terms of the dialogue on domestic issues in this country. I think to a great extent this is true worldwide. At the end of his first year in office, he was a much hated figure in Europe. He had said some very stupid things, some very inflammatory things, but it was very interesting to me that his election was welcomed almost universally in nations that are allied to the United States. Now, maybe they weren't welcomed, at least overtly, in the Soviet Union, but I urge you to keep this in mind, and that is that, getting back to this issue of continuity, if Mondale had been elected president, we would not have had this Geneva meeting. We would have had a new administration taking office, getting its own arms control line into position. We would have the unknown factor of what leverage there would be for U.S. pressure on the Soviet Union. So we do have, I think, an important beginning, as Schultz mentioned yesterday. Now, just let's look quickly at a couple other parts of the world. Southern Africa. Since the election, we've had the coalescing of popular opinion, particularly black American opinion, on the issue of apartheid in South Africa. But we really haven't come to grips with how best to deal with that problem. There hasn't been the debate that really must take place as to how we can best force that country to change a system that is just reprehensible. I think, though, that we have to look at Southern Africa as kind of an overlooked testing place for Reagan policies. Here we have a president who refuses to deal with the Sandinista government, who really flings all kinds of arrows and stones at any communist government that rears its head in the Western Hemisphere. And yet this same president has restored relationships between the United States and Mozambique, which continues to have a government that professes to be Marxist. It is the chief source of aid for Mozambique as it deals with a famine that rivals Ethiopia's in its severity. It was through Reagan administration intercession that you had an agreement between Mozambique and South Africa, which could lead to an eventual agreement between the United States, Angola, and South Africa, leading to the independence of Namibia. And as Fred Barnes suggested, if you have that kind of a deal worked out, then you could even have the incredible prospect of Ronald Reagan, of all presidents, making a deal with Fidel Castro, particularly if he can convince Castro that his present course is leading nowhere. I've used up my time. We could talk about the management of the international debt crisis. We could talk about the enormous trade deficit, but I think in all fairness, we're just going to go to questions. The question, as I gather, is how can you rely on the media when it misreported or didn't report some events in Lebanon? And the second part of the question is just what are we going to do about terrorism, especially terrorism stemming from Syria?
Well, I was referring to differences of opinion between the United States military and the United States press on the role of the press, and I shouldn't have brought it up. I can't answer your first question at all, and there's no point for me to waste your time trying to. On the second question, will we retaliate? There was a time when I thought so, because people in the White House kept telling me that Reagan was getting pretty mad with terrorists. Now Schultz is pretty mad with terrorists. And we have some small military organizations that would be very happy to go out and do the deed if somebody would tell them who the terrorists specifically involved in this or that event were. But your question was, will we ever? And the answer to that is, I don't know, and I don't feel uncomfortable with that answer because I don't think that Mr. Reagan knows either.
May I just say one other thing to that, and that is that in dealing with terrorism, we again see an example of the Reagan administration as being very tough on rhetoric, but really rather passive in taking action. The question is whether the human rights issue, as Carter developed it, is dead in terms of foreign affairs. I don't think so. I think that if you listen to what's coming out of Washington, you're going to perhaps have more emphasis on that. I think that Reagan realizes, A, that it's good politics to talk about human rights, and that phrase is, I notice, coming more and more into his statements. B, it's also very useful in dealing with a Soviet Union that has its internal problems and its problems in handling places like Afghanistan. I think Reagan is also in a better position to talk a little more freely about human rights because of the trend towards the election of democratic governments in South America, so that there are fewer of these right-wing dictatorships that to offend by doing this. So I think probably that's another reason for the rhetoric. At this point, outside of Pinochet, it really doesn't have that much adverse effect on whatever policies he wants to pursue. So I personally would think you'll hear a certain amount of Carter type of rhetoric from this administration. You did during the election year. Do you have anything on that?
No, I agree. I think you will. But it's largely a matter of rhetoric. It's not a matter of policy. It's just something that sounds good. I mean, Reagan, when there was political pressure on him to say something on South Africa, he used a human rights announcement to do that. It doesn't mean anything policy-wise, though, I don't think. Their complaint, the Reaganites' complaint about the Carter policy on human rights, was that it did have some policy dimensions, but they were only enforced against our allies and small countries that were really no problem to us, and in the larger East-West context, it really didn't mean anything.
Yeah. The question is, can the press tell the truth? And the lady has cited my friend Tom Wicker on a rather negative view of that. Since I'm flanked by gentlemen of the Washington establishment, I'd like each one of them to address this.
I think we get good and insightful reporting on arms control in other sections of the New York Times than the one to which you have just referred.
I remember to follow in the same tone that Charlie has started. I remember a column in the fall by Tom Wicker on politics. He wrote a lot of them. I remember one in particular, and that was about the good prospects that Walter Mondale had of winning Texas. He lost by 30 points. But I think there is a lot of investigative reporting. I think there's an awful lot on arms control. I mean, a fellow's just written a book that Walter Mondale talked about repeatedly in the second presidential debate on arms control, Strobe Talbot's Deadly Gambits. It's rather popular. There have been other books on the subject. A lot is known. Some of it's not true that has been reported and is known. But I really don't think that's a problem. I think reporting has become, if we're apologizing for the establishment, we're doing it a lot less than we used to. The press is essentially adversarial with the government. That's something new. It's post-Watergate, post-Vietnam, but there is that attitude. I think today, if the New York Times was in the same position as it was before the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961, when they knew it was coming and didn't report the story, they would report it this time. Certainly nobody was holding back about the possibility of what might happen in Grenada. There were lots of stories about movements and so on there.
The question is, why has the press allowed the National News Conference to expire for lack of support? This is a council that was set up about 10 years ago to monitor the press. I was very much involved in our internal discussions of this question at the Baltimore Sun 10 years ago. We were one of the papers who refused adamantly to have nothing whatsoever to do with this organization, and I can tell you personally, I'm delighted it's expiring. I think it has nothing to do with the American press as we wanted to operate. In Britain, you have what constitutes a national press. in the sense that you have national newspapers circulated all through the country. The result of this is an Official Secrets Act that I think all Americans would find entirely too protective of the government. I think that also in the very nature of the American newspaper, there's an instinct for independence, an instinct to monitor, to check ourselves. And I think by and large, if you would look at the ethics of American journalism as compared to British journalism, including the subsidization of reporters, you would be much reassured that we have in this country an independent press. And I think part of an independent press is not to have some bunch of political journalists who campaign for office on these councils to try to promulgate their views to the press as a whole. The question is, what are the implications in the White House of the organization of the White House news service? We had a cartoon in our editorial page yesterday which showed a placard outside the White House gates and some people dressed as in Russian babushkas obediently reading the pronouncements coming out of the White House. I think it probably isn't that bad, although I don't like any encroachments by the government in the field of news promulgation of this sort. I think what it is, though, is an attempt to supply newspapers with verbatim transcripts of conferences, news conferences, statements, and so on. I would assume that anybody who is silly enough to subscribe to this service will find that unless they set up a separate department of their newspaper or their company to read all this junk, nobody would have time to do it. So I don't really consider it a major threat to the American public. Yeah. The question is, why was the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, which underlay the SALT I treaties, why has this now been discarded in favor of a strategic defense initiative, which, even though the theory back in the early 70s was that if even one missile got through, there would be little incentive for having a missile defense.
The first point I'd like to make was that I was reporting the direction in which I think things may be going in arms control negotiations. I was not by any means telling you that I believe, or on the other hand don't believe, that the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars proposition, is feasible. What I do think is that it's improbable that mankind will forever base its survival on the proposition that there should be destruction, which would mean the end of civilization. Not, I mean, that's a kind of a tenuous proposition in the long reach of history. It has worked up to now, and I often think I could argue either side of the case. It has worked up to now that if the Soviet Union were to attack this country with strategic nuclear weapons, we would have enough after the attack to strike back and demolish the Soviet Union. The arguments for the Star Wars defense are so many and not necessarily consistent, and the proposition depends on which official you talk to often, so that it is rather hard to say what it is. But what I think is that there is no real reason to say we should not inquire into whether this kind of defense is possible. then your question is, it's not, I mean, I assume one of your premises is it's not possible if one missile could get through it. But you see, if one missile or 10 could get through it, the damage that would be done us would be rather huge. But on the other hand, nobody would dare shoot at you if he knew that only 1, 10, or 100 missiles would get through. And so it's conceivable that ballistic missile defense will add, it is conceivable, to stability. Then you said, what is new? Everything almost. At the time of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972, the most that anybody could dare to hope would be that you could put up a defense that could detect incoming missiles, and if there weren't too many of them, and they didn't obliterate your radar, you could knock them out. I'm not going to rehearse here, but I'm sure you don't want me to, all of the things that are on the fire at this point having to do with directed energy weapons. I am not a scientist, and I talk to scientists who tell me it's impossible. That reinforces my idea that maybe we should pursue it. Scientists have told us too many things were impossible. Mr. Weinberger likes to represent or misrepresent, as the case may be, Vannevar Bush, who was our distinguished scientific chief during World War II, who said that you could not do the intercontinental ballistic missile. This doesn't really strain too much what Vannevar Bush said. He didn't realize that you could miniaturize the hydrogen bomb. And so I think that what we're saying here is, what is wrong with research to find out whether we know how to do this? Beyond that, I don't think that the people in authority are going to go. I didn't mean to make a long speech here, but the rest of it is that if you could, by devising ballistic missile defenses, and you may wind up with nothing more than that, defenses of your ballistic missiles, if you could bring about a reduction in ballistic missiles to the point where neither side could think in terms of knocking out the other, and we're not at that point today, wouldn't that be stabilizing? So I don't argue for it because I'm not smart enough to argue for it. But I also think I'm not smart enough to argue against it. And so I plan to keep right on going down the middle of the road shooting both sides.
The question is, what is the implication of the change in power in India, the accession of Rajiv Gandhi, so far as Reagan foreign policy is concerned? I think the geostrategic pressures in South Asia do not change because one leader changes. There are geopolitical pressures which bring the United States, Pakistan, and China together in dealing with Soviet pressure in Asia and in South Asia. There are countervailing pressures because of the Pakistan-India rivalry that require or at least encourage a certain amount of rapport between the Soviet Union and India. So I think we need not let ourselves be dazzled by a change of leadership. Nevertheless, I think out of tragedy we have often seen nations unified. And I think out of the assassination of Indira Gandhi, we do see a wave of unity sweeping over India at a point where it was almost vital. The separatist tendencies in India have been accelerating. It was not only in the Punjab, but it was in Assam and down in the southern parts of India as well. So that you had a tremendous centrifugal force building up prior to the assassination. I think it's in our interest, I think it's in everybody's interest in the world that India hold together and remain the world's largest democracy and a country that is really, truly a democracy. Perhaps the greatest danger of the election is that the majority might be too large, so that the Congress I party will not be very manageable, in the parliament. But nevertheless, I think that India has come out of this a stronger and more unified country. I think that the Reagan administration would be very well advised to realize that the new prime minister is younger. He is a technocrat. He has a background in science. He knows which economies in the world work and which don't, and that these intellectual pressures will move him closer to us, or at least diminish some of the tensions. But again, behind it all are the geostrategic pressures that we can't ignore.
And Joe, let me just add one thing. India isn't a subject that Ronald Reagan's going to spend many sleepless afternoons at the White House worrying about. But some people in the Reagan administration think that Rajiv Gandhi is going to be much more receptive to the United States than his mother. They don't know much about him, but just the fact that he's a technocrat and seems more oriented toward free market economics and so on has encouraged a number of people.
I think it's amazing that Fred Barnes would suggest there are any sleepless afternoons at the White House. Yes, there are two questions that I'm happy have been directed to Fred Barnes.
I think one of them was a tip, not a question.
One is his response to how Reagan will deal with continuing Soviet pressure on Jews and Christians in the Soviet Union. And the other has to do with how the administration is going to deal with the oil finds in Alaska.
You put those in a very general way. Obviously, Reagan knows about religious persecution in the Soviet Union. If he doesn't, there are plenty of conservatives in his administration who will tell him about it. Certainly, it's written about in some of the publications that he reads regularly, particularly Human Events. So he knows about it. It doesn't mean that it's going to stand in the way of arms control talks. We know that. And it probably won't stand in the way of just about anything that he intends to do in regard to the Soviet Union. And probably it shouldn't. It's just something that he doesn't have much leverage over. I don't know about this deal about giving away the gas and oil to the Soviet Union. It would seem to be a little hard to do that when we opposed the natural gas pipeline going from the Soviet Union to Europe. Maybe if we had this one, it could hook into that one and we could send it through the Soviet Union to Europe. I just don't know about it. I'm sorry.
Question to Mr. Cordry is what's being done about the spare parts scandals in the Pentagon?
I suppose I could really give you a sassy answer and say it's going through its periodic exposure to public glare will go away and the problem will persist after you are no longer watching it, and I very much suspect that may be the truth. In the scheme of things, the money wasted on $7,500 coffee pots is not a lot, but in the scheme of things. But what it does do is to make people like you ask questions such as you asked, and therefore it scares the managers of the Pentagon into doing something, because this Congress, which will be interested in cutting budgets, will be able to cite things of this sort in doing what might be a real ransacking sort of cutting. I don't think this will happen, but it could. Other than that, I can only tell you that the Defense Department has a very vigorous Inspector General who announces on a daily basis that this or that person has been indicted or convicted or fined or the money has been returned. The effort to manage contracting better is real. For example, what started a lot of this was an $1,100 plastic cap for a navigator's stool in an airplane, an AWACS airplane. and a sergeant found out about it and squawked. I suspect it may very well have cost the Boeing company that much to produce the thing for the Air Force. Boeing should not have taken the order, but it did, and it charged off overhead for the whole Boeing empire on this plastic stool. Cap. They only ordered one. It would have made more sense to order 1 million. You would have got them all for the same price, perhaps. And now this is what they're doing. I think this is what they say they're doing. You buy larger quantities, you buy them competitively, you buy them from people whom the prime contractors used to try to exclude from the business, and you get the prices down, and that'll go on until the next defense buildup comes, and then the whole problem will be back again. It's another story, but this defense buildup has been so fast, so much money, there was no way that it could conceivably have been managed efficiently.
The question is, after the Soviet Union mops up Afghanistan, will they move into Pakistan to get closer to the Gulf? I'll try to take this question. I just don't think it's really possible for anybody in this country to answer that. I think the Soviet advance into Afghanistan was part of a historic pressure from the old Russian Empire to move into South and Central Asia. By moving into Afghanistan, they are building airfields in closer striking distance of Persian Gulf targets. Whether they would then go on and try to deal with Pakistan, it's hard to say, because for one thing, it could very well trigger Chinese intervention. The Chinese might be willing to tolerate what's going on in Afghanistan as a Soviet sphere of interest, but to conceive of the Chinese permitting the dismemberment of Pakistan is somewhat doubtful. And also, the Baluchis have been watching what's been happening to their brothers in Afghanistan, and I think the lure of an independent Baluchistan, which would be then a Soviet puppet state, is a lot less alluring than it might have been before the Soviet invasion 5 years ago.
Could I have a hand on that one? I think that the premise of your question is very doubtful. I don't think the Soviet Union can mop up in Afghanistan unless it is willing to dedicate a force approximately triple the size that it has in there now, and it shows no sign of doing so. As far as being closer to the Persian Gulf is concerned, the Soviet Union can run around from its own bases in the Soviet Union and take out the Persian Gulf or the U.S. Navy, or try. So tactically, they might be a little better off with a base in Afghanistan, but not much. I think they've got a bear by the tail, frankly.
The question has to do with drugs coming into this country from South America, Latin America, and also the inflow of illegal immigrants. Do you want to?
Well, I'll try those, sure. There's obviously a reason why I'd say it's hard to stop the drugs from coming in. There's a spectacularly large market for them in the United States. Billions of dollars are spent. That's going to continue. The drugs are going to continue to come in. Efforts are successful in small areas. If you ever talk to George Bush about drugs, he'll tell you about how successful the effort was in Florida, where they cut back. Well, it just went somewhere else, though. I mean, we have big borders. You can fly in, come in by boat, walk, whatever. So it's don't get your hopes up. On illegal aliens, there is a political problem, and there's always going to be one. There's no sort of bill that's going to be effective, some legislation that's going to be effective, unless it has some restraints on employers and some clout with them, and also probably does something that's going to make Hispanics very unhappy and feel that they're being racially discriminated against. I don't know how you're going to get around it. You couldn't last year with the Simpson-Mazzoli bill. My personal view is that the illegal alien crisis isn't one, and it's much overrated as a problem, but many people disagree with that. Particularly if you remember the second Mondale-Reagan debate, they were both questioned about it and handled it very gingerly, but some reporters in particular think it's a very important problem. But the experience in 1984 would suggest that it's one that's not going to be dealt with legislatively in any strong way soon.
The question is, why isn't the press tougher on congressmen who protect single-source suppliers to the Pentagon?
Well, I don't know what you can do other than to report it. What you said was absolutely right, except I think it was the M1 tank rather than the M60, wasn't it? But it's always possible, this may be a hard thing to accept, but it's always possible that Congress gets it right too. And they may have figured out that this was, I don't think they did, by the way, but they may have figured out this was a cheaper way to do it. But if you're asking me, can the press stop Congress from yielding to constituencies, I think you know the answer, but we can point it out.
The question is to Mr. Cordry, his assessment of the nuclear freeze movement. Go ahead.
I think it's peaked, and that it does not have significance if you mean by that, will it happen? Will there be a freeze? But I think it is also it has been a part of the gigantic pressure that the White House has felt over the last 2, 3, 4 years, and that this has had something to do with its greater willingness to negotiate on arms control. But as far as a nuclear freeze is concerned, I think it can't be defined, and I think it can't be negotiated. And I think that those are two things that make it not all that significant. But as a political movement, I think it's had its impact.
I think we're running into Frank Bird's deadline.
It's not my deadline. I should disavow that. Gentlemen, we are grateful that you've taken so much of your valuable time and spent it with us this evening. It's a pleasure.